Hi guys, my name is James and I am here today to talk to you about YA books. We're going to get controversial up on this channel because apparently I'm not someone who likes YA books, and that's no bueno here on the BookTube space. Now, what I want to talk to you about today is not any particular problem I have with YA books. More, I want to just talk about what my real thoughts are. What are my actual, real, legitimate big boy thoughts on YA books? Because if you've followed this channel for a length of time, if you've watched some of my discussion videos, you might see that I normally refer to YA books as baby books for babies, which is obviously not true. They're not. You can't give a 1-year-old baby a book like City of Bones and then expect them to read it. That's nonsense. But the point I'm trying to make with the facetious comments about it is that obviously there is a divide between YA books and adult books, which didn't really exist before, mainly because YA didn't exist. So let's talk about why is it that YA books really are just not for me, and some of the merits that I think they do have, because I do think they have some merits. Don't get me wrong, I'm not like a big hater. If you like YA, that is absolutely fine. You've got your reasons. It's fine. It doesn't affect me in literally any way whatsoever, which is why I really don't talk about it too much anymore. But I just want to clear the air, get my real thoughts out there. So that's the easiest way to do this, would be to sort of talk about the reading experience that I've had, and how that sort of shaped the way I view books. So in England, there was a thing when I was a wee schoolboy called the Oxford Reading Tree, which was like a series of 8 levels that you had to progress through to read. So you had to read like a certain number of books from each tier, and they got progressively more complex until you reached like the end, and then you were just like allowed to read whatever you want, and you could like progress through this as quickly as you wanted to, and I did fine, like whatever, you know. I got to the end, and then it's all very structured. It's very structured reading when you're a school kid, and we don't have such required reading after that point, which is where YA comes into the equation. So this happens in primary school. I guess you'd call it grade school. It's like from when you're 4 till like 11. So after that, you're sort of pushed out on your own. Not really any guidance on what to read next. And then one of two things happens. Either you start reading books on your own, you go out and you find them, or you go out and you never pick up a book again, which has sort of happened to me for quite a long time. Reading is a thing that was it was always treated as a chore in schools, right? So once you didn't have to do it anymore as a kid, you're like, yeah, well, that's that. I'm done with it. I'm not going to do it again. And when you grow up a little bit, get to like 14, 15, you think, oh, you know, maybe I will read some books again. And around this time in my life, obviously, Harry Potter was just coming out, you know, when I was like 12, I don't know. When did the first Harry Potter book come out? Fuck if I know. But like, it sort of picked up steam in the UK when I was like 13, 14 maybe. It's like, I guess that's when Goblet of Fire came out, I suppose. Like, that's when I remember it sort of taking off into this big thing. And I read those mostly because it was sort of a cultural zeitgeist, but because they were still coming out, I was still getting older as the series was going on, and I was like reading these books, and in between them I would try and read other books. But because we didn't have, like, you know, the guidance on what books are appropriate for what ages or whatever, I'm just like picking up books that exist. I went with Lord of the Rings after I saw the films when I was like 12, and I didn't get on with that because, as you know, it is like one of those like hard tier level books that really shouldn't be read until you're like slightly older. I mean, I know some people that have read Lord of the Rings or whatever when they're that age and found it fine, but it was too much for me. But then I was like, well, man, I really want to like read some sort of fantasy thing. I'm loving these Lord of the Rings films, so I picked up this, which was a big mistake as well. So I tried to read that. Never got more than like 300 or so pages through before just being like, this is too much, and I put it down. And at that point I just decided, you know, maybe reading's not for me. And then like the final Harry Potter book came out, and I just didn't read it. I didn't read it. The kind of books that I was reading around this age were things like Artemis Fowl, and the series of unfortunate events, which I don't have a copy of, and like Alice in Wonderland, like, you know, these sort of more traditional kid books. But then at the same time I was getting older, and they were like, you know, kids books like for actual children, not really doing it for me anymore. And at this point, you know, like 2004, 2005, YA wasn't a thing that existed, guys. Like, I'm sure there were books out there that, were they released now, would be classified as YA, but it wasn't really a division. You know, you had children's books and then adult books, and there's this gap, right? So then I went to university, finished uni, whatever. Didn't really read any fiction the whole time, but still managed to maintain quite a significant collection of books that I just sort of had and didn't ever read. I don't know why. Did I think it made me look smart? I don't know. Maybe on a subconscious level I did, but I didn't really read any of them. And then university finished, and I got a job, and then I had to sort of be on a train for 3 hours a day total. And I was like, well, Jesus Christ, like, what am I going to do on this fucking train ride, right? So I'm like, well, maybe I'll read a book. And I started reading The Witcher Saga, which was like adult fantasy, and I found that I could read it. And I was like, oh, this is like the first book I've read in like 6 years or whatever, you know, for fun. And I was like, hey, I'm enjoying this. But other books like The Wheel of Time, like, I still had, and I was like, oh man, like, I could read this again, but I was kind of intimidated, to be perfectly honest. Like, I was like, maybe, you know, adult books are still too hard for me to read a book of that length. And then I decided, well, you know, what if we just read something that's kind of fluffy and fun? And then I heard about, you know, like YA books, and I seem to have gravitated towards contemporary YA at the time. I read Paper Towns. I thought it was alright. I read All the Bright Places, and that was not great. And then I read We Were Liars, which I thought was good. And then, like, there was like a series of a time where I read YA books. So I was like, you know, this is pretty good. And then I found that I was reading more and more. You know, The Hunger Games, read all of those, or like all of that stuff, you know. And then I found I was reading more and more, and thought, well, maybe it's time, you know. And what the catalyst really for what drove me towards adult books was I started to read a few more adult books, but I was still dipping into YA. And then I read this book, Me and Earl and the Dying Girl by Jesse Andrews. This book is what I would describe as a deconstruction of your traditional YA story, because even though it has a pretty typical YA premise, it really takes jabs at itself. It really takes jabs at the genre it's writing in, and it's really like almost a parody of YA, even though I guess it's not really, but that's the sort of feel I got from it. And then I sort of tried to read another book. I can't remember what it was, but I tried to read another book and I just found that I couldn't do it. Like the YA themes were just now so obvious to me. It was so cliche and typical. And maybe it's just, you know, my experience of reading certain types of books. Then I gave like the Mortal Instruments a go. City of Bones is like okay, and then I tried to read the next one and I was like, this is like dog shit. I couldn't deal with it. I just couldn't deal with like the teen drama premise anymore. I couldn't do it. And then I just started to read adult only books, and then just as a joke, I decided that YA books are obviously for children. Now, let's talk about that idea, because I think a lot of people, especially on BookTube, can get kind of defensive about YA books. You know, it's perfectly okay for me as a 25-year-old woman or whatever to read YA, and you're right, it is absolutely, like, you can read whatever books you want. But I think, just from my point of view, the themes and characters that are explored in YA are very surface level. They're very shallow. They don't really reflect the real world. Like as much as contemporary YA is set in our actual world, they are more or less a genre unto themselves, in where teenagers are the be all and end all of human existence. And that's just not true. I think a lot of people that are still reading YA, typically you'll find are still in education, or, you know, are still kind of in that, because like there is an argument to be had that there is an extension of the adolescent period now, bringing my sociology degree into it. But like there's been this sort of move from people growing up very quickly, sort of like by the age of 18, like, oh, I moved out at 18, went around, traveled the world, I'm living on my own, I'm an independent adult. Like, we've moved away from that to a period of time where people are discovering themselves for a longer period, right? So people don't really settle down into careers or anything until a much older age. And I think from my perspective, I didn't have that much of an extension. Like I went to university, like that's the sort of extension, and then almost immediately afterwards, it took a little while, but almost immediately afterwards I got like a proper adult job, and then I stopped being able to relate to things that were for younger readers, just because, you know, these themes of finding yourself and not knowing, oh, like teen romance is like, it's the passion is all that, like all of that kind of gets beaten out of you as you grow up, I guess, for some people. I mean, maybe for some people it's different, they keep that sense of wonder about the world and all of that, but like these characters and these themes just seemed alien to me after a while, and therefore I didn't enjoy them so much anymore. So do I think YA books are baby books for babies? Absolutely not. Like, they're a bridge gap. Like, my ultimate take on YA is that it bridges that gap, right, for you between children's books, adult books, and sort of knowing what to read. You know, I think if YA existed really as a thing when I was like 12, I probably would have fucking loved that for a long period of time, because it would have given you like sort of that little gap, that stepping stone approach to literature that's sort of beaten into you as a kid. You know, it gives you that ladder to climb until you're more comfortable reading more adult books. And it did work that way for me as well. You know, sort of trying to find my feet with getting back into reading after a long hiatus from it. But I think now I've just moved on. You know, I've just moved on from those characters and those themes, unless it's sort of commenting on them in a clever way, or it's doing something really unique with it. I'm just not interested in teen drama. Like Jessie Andrews, I think for me is probably like my top YA author, because Me and Earl of the Dying Girl and The Haters both sort of play with these ideas of YA tropes. Like this book in particular really highlights how in most YA stories, there's no consequences for an awful decision. And in this book, like, they make all the typical choices you would think that a YA protagonist would make, and it all blows up spectacularly in their faces, which I thought was brilliant. But, you know, unless it's something special, I'm not interested in teenagers being these philosopher kings that they are so often made out to be in YA. It's just not for me, and that's okay. And it's okay if it is for you. You know, if you are still finding those sort of books enjoyable, that's absolutely fine. Do I encourage you to try and push yourself to read adult books? I mean, sure, read, you know, whatever you want, but and don't, like, I just would just plead that you don't rule out books because you think they're too hard for you until you've tried. You know, that's sort of a philosophy for life in general. Don't rule it out until you've at least given it a go and found for yourself whether it works for you or not. And that's it. The end of the YA discussion. So thanks for stopping by. Please check out my blog, which I have now. It's www.plotsandpoints.wordpress.com. Link is in the description. You can follow me on Twitter @plotsandpoints. And that's it. I'll see you next time. Bye.